Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. In this week's conversation, I am continuing with my lovely guest, Dr. Sarah Clunis, who is the Academic Partnerships Director and Curator of the African Collections and the Peabody Museum here at Harvard University. Sarah, last week we spoke about, we were just getting into, our conversation sort of tapered off as we were just getting into some of the complexity that we have to approach the project and the process of dealing with sacred objects. And I loved the intervention that you brought to our attention to say, we've got the easy moves. And I think a lot of folks in public discourse have stuck with the easy moves to say, okay, the Benin Bronzes, that was a moment of colonial violence, that was a moment of looting. But what you demonstrated to us last week was to say, we've got to go beyond that. We've got to have a vocabulary that is more extensive than that. And that brought up quite a lot of things for me. The first of which concerns, and I'm sort of dealing with this question just because my research is kind of focusing on this, but it's dealing with the question of ontology, right? So in valorizing the wound, and the wound is the loot, it's the violence, it's the taking of these possessions away from these communities, in valorizing that, we're not attending to the context specificities of these artifacts as they existed within the Benin Kingdom prior to their being taken. And we're also not dealing with what has happened after that moment, because there is an after, they have a life after that moment across the world, in whether it be in the British, Historical Museum, whether it be in various other collections all across the globe. You know, these sacred items have moments. And I come to the function, or to the question of ontology rather, because of a couple of things that you said, the first of which is caring for and treating these artifacts and these objects with a certain level of sacredness when you're handling them. From last week's discussion, what I did want to sort of ask though about, and what I really wanted to think about, which really kind of got my cogs going, was when you said you're not sure about displaying the items. And this is not necessarily only just the Benin Bronzes, for example, but it's the entire African collection, right? I'm thinking that you're talking about, which is to say, because it is constitutive of so many sacred items. And as you said, you're wary of putting these items on display. And I'm interested in that suggestion for a number of reasons. The first of which is, for example, I'm a South African. I find myself at Harvard as a Harvard South African fellow. There's certain items, and I did art history as a minor back in the day. And I look at certain objects as part and parcel of my art history curriculum in books and in exhibition magazines, and I find myself at Harvard, and I think it would be so lovely to, for example, walk into the Peabody and get to interact with some of these artifacts and some of these objects in various ways. For example, I'm cooking up a particular proposal that we're going to have off air, thinking precisely about that, because this particular project is actually facilitated by my own national heritage and arts collection back at home at the University of Fort Hare, and we have one of the largest collections in the country of works produced by African artists, by Black artists. And I'm thinking about whether or not there's a collaboration that can happen here, but we're going to talk about that. So I'm thinking about those kinds of moves, right? I'm thinking about, and you're going to have another Siseko who find themselves at Harvard, who's read about some of these items and who's read about some of these, and who's dying, who's absolutely yearning to encounter. And I'll tell you why I say this, and then I'll give you an opportunity to respond. But when I trained in art history, I had black females who taught me. Zamanzele, who's now at UC Berkeley, Sami Mdluli, who's now the director of the Standard Bank Art Gallery, Pindezwa Miaga, who's now at the University of the Western Cape back in South Africa. So a lot of, amazing black women who kind of poured over black art history, and who were trying to write into existence black art theory, right? And one of the paintings that I was obsessed with as a child, as a student, was Dumile Feni's African Guernica. I'd written about it, I had seen it in images, I had theorized it, I had thought about the kinds of experiences that one has seeing that particular collection. I moved to the University of Fort Hare, but prior to moving to the University of Fort Hare, Sami Mdluli conducts an inaugural exhibition of Dumile Feni's collection as curator and director of the Standard Bank Art Gallery. Unfortunately, I missed that collection, that curated exhibition. Then at the University of Pretoria, we had the opening of the Javid Arts Gallery, which is a new gallery in South Africa, adding to the number of galleries that we have, which is good because it means more works can come into public view and people can interact with them, which is very, very exciting. But the inaugural exhibition of the Javid brought out Dumile Feni's African Guernica, and that was the first time I saw it. And it is a towering image, artwork, and it was absolutely beautiful. And I remember the first time I saw it, I wept. Not for any other reason other than the fact that I had seen this image, I had theorized this image, I had thought about this image, and here I was finally confronting it in its gorgeous magnitude. Confronting very, very deep philosophical questions in front of me. And of course, everybody is like, oh no, it will only be on exhibition for like 6 months, and then it has to go back because lighting, cooling, etc. It needs to be well taken care of. And funny enough, that particular artwork ended up being on display for at least about, I think it was maybe 16 or 18 months because of the pandemic, and so works couldn't be transported back.
Because that's what you wanted.
Right? And now, I have access, for example, to some of Dumile Feni's works in the NAHEX collection at the University of Fort Hare, but not many people do. And I get it. It's fragile. And it can't be doing, public appearances every now and then. But I wonder what it does for us, especially as Black theorists working in the tradition, working in the disciplines of art history, to say to our communities, to our students, to our graduate students, to faculty who read some of our works, here's the stuff that we've been writing about. How's about we engage with it? Not as fanfare, not as artworks, but as part and parcel of this work of attending to some of our histories. So I guess I'm asking a two-pronged question. The first is what happens indeed when we do that kind of work, when we allow the public and ourselves to engage with what we're writing with in the public domain, and also to see that engagement, because something happens that is, I think, a bit more profound than just the work of us theorizing and accessing these works as we have access to them in storage. So that's the first part in the sense of what happens when we enliven these works. But the second would be to sort of invite you to say more about your reservations, because I think those are valid and legitimate as well, which is to say, because I think maybe just as an off the surface kind of reading, your reservations might come from the fact that putting these items on display might lead to the fanfare. It might lead to the problematic superficial engagement that continues to valorize particular narratives, discourses, and histories that have meant that these items find themselves where they are today.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say that that engagement is the reason I do what I do, is so that I can have that engagement every day if I choose to. It grounds me, and I am as indebted to the cultural items that I work with as maybe they are indebted to me and the care that I give them, right? Many people have this experience that you experienced in viewing the art form that the African Guernica, when they first encountered the Benin Bronzes. And I will say that sometimes what I explain to people about the works themselves is that for the most part, they are imbued with ashe. So that they are not, I feel this way about artworks in general, right? My concept of artists is very shamanic. Like, I look at, and this goes beyond culture, I feel that the earliest Homo sapiens and Neanderthals even created art as a way of manifesting intent, as a way of a cathartic experience. Art is very much, in the creation of art forms, this sort of mark making, if you will, is very much tied up with creation and abundance and fecundity and all the things that matter to human beings. But these bronzes in particular are imbued with a particular kind of energy, spiritual energy, in particular the plaques, that means that regardless of where they are, they want to be seen. The plaques were made to be seen. They were made to be lining the courtroom of the Oba, so that much like the citadels in the ancient Near East that had these incredible reliefs that you can see casts of, if you go to the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, of Ashurnasirpal and Ashurbanipal, like, conquering the lioness or taking down, enemies. This idea of the walls of this courtroom as one walks toward the Oba being lined with these bronze plaques, which are really more of a copper alloy, some brass incorporated, but we know them as the Benin Bronzes. And these plaques are showing the might of the Oba. They're very militarized. All of them are militarized.
And also the sacredness of the court, right?
The sacredness of the court, and that is communicated through not only the materials that the casts are made of, the plaques are made of. They're made of like the work of blacksmiths, like iron, right? So this is the work of Ogun, people who are ruled by the deity Ogun, right? This blacksmith that from the beginning of time, Ile Ife, we have stories of Ogun. And then the imagery that you see on the plaques, the Ebe Amen, the river leaves, the coral beads that adorn the chiefs and the nobility, and the obas that are represented in the plaques relate to the sea. The Ebe Amen, the river leaves, relate to the water which flows into the sea, the rivers that flow into the sea. The images of Portuguese, which you see, they're ubiquitous throughout on the plaques. The Portuguese came across the sea with wealth, with abundance to trade with. They brought coral, right? All of this relates to the deity Olokun, which again we see references to Olokun going all the way back to Ile Ife. There was a cult for Olokun. And Olokun is a non-binary entity. Olokun is female if you go more inland, and becomes male as you go more towards the coast, right? And Olokun is also worshipped in the diaspora. So in these plaques, which are, I would say they are sacred, but they are meant to be viewed in very much the same way that, you know, artworks in the Western world are meant to be viewed. They're meant to be displayed as royal arts. They're meant to communicate the prowess and the sort of virility and the power of the Oba and all of the tributary states to that Oba, all of the tributary states in the area that for centuries and centuries have owed everything to the Oba, that have to go through the Oba and the Benin Kingdom in order to do any kind of trade, right? The Oba was this power. The Benin Kingdom was this power in this area. Such a great power, in fact, that we have, you know, the Dahomean kingdom, the country that, you know, the Dahomey and the Fan occupy, eventually is named Benin, you know, in the, sort of the proximity to the Benin Kingdom, just like Ghana is named Ghana to relate to the great African kingdom of Ghana, right? So we see how central and important the Benin Kingdom was and is in terms of the life that we see in southwestern Nigeria. But this then extends to the Igbo and their relationship and the Ibibio and the Idoma and all of the Owo Yoruba and the Oyo Yoruba and like all of these communities, the Wari, Itsekiri, like all of these communities were in many ways tributary states to the Oba for centuries and centuries. So these plaques communicate that relationship because they not only communicate representations of people in the Benin Kingdom, but they also communicate representations of tributary states, chiefs and nobles that are outside of the Benin Kingdom that owe the Benin Kingdom. And the Portuguese are represented as well because they are vassals. They're mercenaries for the Benin Kingdom. That's another thing people don't understand. They think, oh, they're European, they came, they must have lorded it over them. You know, like they have this sort of like, again, this sort of modernist idea of colonial, you know, colonized. When in fact the relationship between the Portuguese and the Benin Kingdom was very much one I consider of equals, and it had very much to do with trade, and the Portuguese were vassals for the Benin Kingdom. In other words, if the Oba wanted the Portuguese soldiers to go and fight for him, they would go and fight for him, right? So I think it's important to preface conversations about the Benin Kingdom by understanding somewhat, and this is just a little tiny bit about the history, especially with all the different oral histories, that this idea was that there was this grand history and this grand kingdom that really, and it wasn't the first. Yoruba, Ile Ife, Akan, Dahomean, Igbo Ikwo. I mean, you know, this was a space of kingdoms and kings and royalty. And I'm not just saying that because I'm Afrocentric, which I am, but you know, this is history, right? So when the British decided that they wanted to colonize this area, as the British do, one of the things that they confronted was, like they did in Ghana, was when they exiled the Asante Hene in the late 19th century, and he went to the Seychelles, I believe. They exiled him to the Seychelles, and he wore on a dinka cloth the Asante Hene Ajiman Prempeh I. He was exiled by the British. Ovan Ramwe, also exiled after the 1897 invasion of Benin Kingdom. These need to be connected because what you're seeing here is that there is a power that already resides in the area that the British want to have power over, right? And the British wanted to get rid of the Obas in terms of power, right? That Oba no longer had power in this area so that they can continue to do the kinds of trade that they wanted to do and eventually colonize and make what we know as present-day Nigeria, right? And they had, in many ways, the support of the tributary communities because the tributary communities could not go through the trade with the British because they would be taxed by the Oba. They had to go through the Oba. So imagine, like for instance, Nana of the Itsekiri, prior to the British military invasion of the Benin Kingdom, already had some issues with the British and wanted to trade with the British separate and apart from the Oba. Right?
Could I just make an observation that it reminds me of what you've just said. reminds me of the observation we find in the work of Mazasugunene once again, when he's like, part and parcel of what happens in the unraveling of the state architecture that existed pre-colonially is that you've got folks who are taking advantage of what the British colonial empire is doing in sort of breaking down this architecture, because folks have the opportunity for the advancement of station, for easier trade, as you say. So now I don't have to...
And you see that in the colonial world too, right? You see that also in the post-colonial world. Is there enough space for all of us?
Exactly, right? So and part of that, I think, is it adds even more to the idea of complexifying our readings of the situation, which is to say, it's not this bifurcated, easy, clean, black and white kind of move. There's a whole host of stuff happening for a number of reasons.
And to approach it that way, again, going back to our earlier conversation, the previous conversation, is really very Western.
Yeah.
This idea that it's good or bad, evil or holy, but and again, I want to preface everything I say because many times when I speak about the history and what I know about the history, people feel sometimes that I am justifying the 1897 invasion. God forbid. I would never be justifying colonial violence.
But you're contextualizing how and where it's playing itself out.
I think it's important because I think it is the truth, first of all. And I think it also gives people a more realistic view of, I think part of the ignorance that exists around Africa is this idea that there's always a system of victimization when it comes to Africans, right? And that takes out of play ideas about African power, African agency, African social systems and social structures, African kingdoms in general. That denies and deprives Africa of power. I mean, even
an agency, as you say.
An agency. I mean, it just. So I can't. It's an easy thing, and it's easy for the argument in terms of repatriation to just say victims, oppressors, right? But I'm just trying to set up the story so that one understands how things happened, because in many Nigerian historians refer to what the British and the West tends to call the British expedition. An expedition. This is ridiculous, okay? What is an expedition? We're going to go for an expedition for coffee later, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is an expedition, right? Like, it's a discovery of things. It's like it's a journey, right? It was an invasion. It was a violent invasion, right? That the British only won because of their ability to have more guns and equipment, right? The Benin Kingdom was a military, miracle. It was, and it had been for centuries. They were incredibly militarized.
Which is how they managed to become the kingdom and to maintain their authority and rulership over the territories that are contributing to this kingdom, because they have military might.
We see guns in plaques.
Yeah.
Right? We see guns over and over again in plaques. We see ebon swords. We see, ritual swords. But we see guns, right? And so guns were part of the trade as well. And so it's important again to understand this relationship, and then the relationship of power that the Benin Kingdom had over all of the different areas in Nigeria at the time, to understand the sort of dynamics of what was happening with the British. Right? So the British wanted to depose the Oba because the Oba was, and then they had them sign all these contracts, and my students were all like, why did Nana sign the contract and not abide by what the contract said? And why did, the Oba sign the contract? And then, because you have these letters from the Britishers saying, they signed the contract, we have the paperwork, but they're not abiding by the paperwork. And I was like, well, first of all, I know of no historical context in this area in which a treaty is done by signing a piece of paper, right? That's the first cultural ignorance, right? The British were like, if we have the paperwork, we're okay. But the Oba's probably like, okay, get out of my
Yes,
palace now.
yes, yes, yes.
You want this? Go.
Take it, leave.
You know, I feel like I see the same thing in Jamaica sometimes, you know, in the context of tourism, not to make it like a comparison, but where people will be like, I want this, I want that, I want that. And a Jamaican person that is in a serving role, a service role, because it's a tourist industry there, will say, I worked in the tourist industry in Jamaica as well, will say, yeah, man, no problem. And then they go about and they do their business. And then the person is like, why am I not getting the cigarettes I wanted and the rum I wanted and the this I wanted? And I think this is a, you know, maybe this is an African thing.
Yeah.
Maybe this is just a sort of resistance thing, like the slow, different ways we can resist.
Yeah.
Whatever the case may
Yeah.
be. But yeah, man, no problem is really not yeah, man, no problem.
It's not,
right?
it's not I'm conceding to what you're... it's not...
It's never a
yeah,
concession.
yeah.
Just like soon come. You coming? Soon come. Which might mean 5 minutes or never.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
There's a whole broad...
There's a spectrum there.
A spectrum there of when I will arrive.
yeah.
Right? So the thing is, like, so basically what I said is that there's just these gigantic cultural differences. The British feel like they're getting what they want and getting things signed, but the people who have control and power, who are indigenous to this region, they don't business with the British. They have power. The Oba never even conceived of the British as a threat, I think, until right before the invasion, right? Where the you know, this upstart British, I'm trying to think of his name now. I can't remember. Anyway, it'll come to me. But he is there at the time during, like, what you would say the Christmas season or the winter season. The other British governor at the time has gone back to England, and this other gentleman is deciding he's going to go to the Benin Kingdom. Now, so he's just there in a temporary role, but he wants to show off. He's going
And
to
of
see.
course solidify
So he goes
and buy
with,
himself favor,
like,
etc.
250 people, very few guns, they say. There are different stories about that too. And he's moving towards the Benin Kingdom. It's the Igwe Festival, which still occurs to this day, or in December to January. And in the Igwe Festival, foreigners cannot go into the kingdom. Okay, so there's a cultural issue here as well. And many runners are sent. They're sent to dissuade the British. They know the British are coming. Everybody knows. There's no cell phones, but everybody knows, right? And they go and they say, no, don't come any further. You're in danger if you move any further. No one is allowed in the kingdom at this time. It's the Igwe Festival. They don't listen, and they get slaughtered. Even though the Oba, they say they have proof that the Oba said, don't hurt them, whatever. At that point, they use this, there are three British people who survive. They go back, they tell the British, then the British decide they're going to do this invasion. But this is all, already we have in the archives letters that show that they knew that there was ivory there, there was bronzes there. They said, oh, there's lots of things there that we can then collect, and we can sell these things, and they will pay for they'll pay for the invasion, for the expedition. So that we have letters to prove that it wasn't some, like, wild, in the moment looting, which does happen during these kinds of, you know, military things. There was a level of premeditation there.
It was calculated.
Oh, it was very calculated. So they knew they were going to take the ivories and things. They knew they were going to sell them when they went back to London. And this was in February of 1897 was the invasion. By September of 1897, these works are on display in the British Museum. So they wasted no time. And then the conversation becomes about, how could Africans make these things? You know, it becomes one about, like, I want to say, goes into natural science and eugenics, and how is it possible for African people to have made such amazing works of art. You know, that becomes the conversation. So it's like one racist ideology to another racist ideology. But the point is, this sets up the scene for the invasion and what happens during the invasion. Now, many Nigerians refer to this as the Anglo-Benin War. They never refer to it as the British expedition unless they've sort of, you know, done some work in Britain or, you know, with sort of Western sources. Primarily, when I see Nigerian historians talking about this event, they talk about it as the Anglo-Benin War, which has a completely different ring to it than an expedition, right? It is called a war. War gives agency to both parties. They speak about the Benin Kingdom as fighting bravely you know, majestically, like they build up the oral history of the Benin Kingdom, which we don't see in the different written historical accounts that we get.
But I think that demonstrates something, though, Sarah, which is to say, who legitimately across time and space is always seen as the legitimate wielder of violence. And that is not blackness, because we see it in the Haitian Revolution and the supposed reparations the reparations that the Haitian government has to pay to the French.
Ridiculous.
That's
the most ridiculous thing.
Precisely. We see it in every single state on the continent. We see it in Zimbabwe, for example, with the Gukurahundi. We see it, and of course, again, you know, one can sort of have this kind of contested question of, you know, how does one understand the wielding of violence in the case of Gukurahundi? Because also it's always a matter of, we are not legitimate wielders of violence against whiteness, but we can be legitimate wielders of violence against each other. Which is what we see in the case of Rwanda.
Which places blackness only in the situation of the acceptance of violence.
Precisely, right? So to think about blackness outside of those confines and to sort of confer legitimate wielding of violence by blackness, that's completely incomprehensible, and we've seen it in the theorization of statecraft from the Enlightenment era all the way to neoliberal conceptions of the state, with attempts to sort of to save liberalism in contemporary debates in political philosophy today. You know, there's still this divorcing of, and that's why some of our colleagues will reject, and of course I reject it myself for other reasons, but that's why some of our colleagues will reject Afro-pessimism, because Afro-pessimism petitions for the legitimacy of the wielding of violence by blackness, right? But I did want to get back to the question of...
I do want to address though, because
yes.
I think that it's very important, because it places us, if we don't have agency to revolt, to rebel. For instance, I'm very sensitive. I grew up learning about slave rebellions and slave revolts. That was a very important part of our core curriculum in the Caribbean. And I came here in the South and realized it was just sort of being implemented like in the last 10, 15 years. And if you, and I mean, I'm also Jewish on my mother's side, right? So I was raised Jewish and raised with this idea, knowing the history of the Holocaust and just different pogroms and oppressions that Jews have faced in different countries, being seen as outsiders, even if they're from that country, right? This idea of people not fighting back, people not defending themselves, people not having the power and agency to militarize, to organize, to see and to demand a better lives for themselves. This is a fiction.
Of course it is.
It's a fiction.
But it's a beautiful fiction that gets legitimated in the case of South Africa with the '94 Rainbow Nation miracle of Mandela,
Tell
right?
me about
because so it gets legitimated in the sense that 1993 Chris Hani gets assassinated because Chris Hani is kind of petitioning for reparations and a real sense of addressing the socio-political underlying conditions in South Africa, which are still playing themselves out today. But Mandela comes about and says, okay, cool, put down your arms, let's not take to the streets. We know our good comrade of the South African Communist Party has been assassinated, but we can get over this, right? And he's kind of this figure that holds the country together. Then you've got Tutu's Ubuntu, which of course is Christianized, and itself this turn the other cheek. So all of these moves, post-94, post-democracy, are what legitimate the idea, the international global theories of blackness as unable and should be accepting of the fact they're unable to, accepting of the fact that they're unable to wield violence.
It's
right?
strategic, though.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And
It's not truth.
of course. But that's what I mean is that South Africa's quote unquote miracle, Rainbow Nation miracle, which is coming apart at the seams, by the way, today, legitimates historical conceptions of statecraft and state theory because it continues to locate blackness at the receiving end of violence, right? So go back to Thomas Hobbes' work, go back to Hume's work,
Right.
go back to all of these sort of characters of liberal enlightenment, statecraft, and all of them, Hegel himself in the Phenomenology of Spirit, continue to locate blackness at the receiving end of violence and continue to sort of take away the agency of blackness as legitimate wielders of violence. So this is one of the reasons why you will have, in the case of the Benin Kingdom, British historiographers and British historiography kind of talking to a very, very different account of what happened when you compare their accounts, for example, to the oral histories, right, in terms of the experiences of the revolution, not the revolution, but this kind of resistance, right, of, and when we do wield violence, of course, even think about, again, British historiography, colonial historiography, the wielding of violence by blackness is savagery.
Oh yeah, and it must be controlled. But I mean, that is when everything comes out: the guns, the bombs, the everything. Yes.
Absolutely. If it's not savagery, it's legitimate only insofar as it is cannibalism.
Oh yeah.
Right. So
Which is savagery.
Exactly.
It just all
right.
boils down to savagery.
So there isn't a way in which within the lexicon of statecraft, blackness can legitimately wield violence. But I do want to get back to in the context of this history, to the questions of how do we, as you say, so these items are now taken away in the context of a contested history, in the context of some folks who will say, actually, we welcome the British liberating us from this kind of system that is oppressive, that has us paying taxes to a particular kingdom in order for us to be able to facilitate trade, etc.
Well, that's nicely put. I don't think it's exactly seen that way. I think it's the idea that it's what's happening tomorrow is that, you know what I mean? In the idea that if I don't have to go through the Oba, I don't know if there was, I can't speak and say that there was some kind of long-term view of what was going to happen. I don't think anyone necessarily expected. Colonialism in that form had never occurred in that area before, in that particular form, in the British colonialism.
There's so much that you always kind of trigger in my mind. It reminds me again of what we see in Southern Africa around British colonialism. And again, Nia and I had this conversation 2 weeks ago, whereby we were thinking about the ways in which, for example, the foreigner who is the British is welcomed, because we don't
It throws people off,
right?
I think so.
We welcome the foreigner in Southern Africa not because we're naive,
Not because we think they're a god.
exactly, but because we're like, you're in a foreign land. This is our land,
Yeah.
and we know how to be hospitable to our
Custom.
guests.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We need to welcome our guests.
And it's
We
not
need
the danger you know.
Yes.
And so that
Yes.
throws things off and creates all kinds of. And the irony is that when the British, post the expedition and the establishment of colonialism, because colonialism happened really quickly after that, because that was
It's
it.
an opportunity.
That's what needed to happen in the eyes of the British, right? That's the thing that people need to see. This was the opportunity to colonialize Nigeria or colonize Nigeria. You couldn't do it if the Oba was still in power, right?
So you need to remove.
But people need to see
Yes,
that that's how much power.
Yes. Now, of course, there's and there are a number of things that happen, and I think Toyin Falola has also written about this, sort of corroborating the epistemic and ontological violence that comes with British colonialism. So it's the removal of the Oba in the first instance. It's the confiscation of land or territory or assets that are owned by the king, by the ruling figure. So, for example, and I always use this example in Makanda, in Grahamstown, in the Eastern Cape, we have, for example, the Anglican Cathedral. The Anglican Cathedral sits on what was, before that time, on land that was Makana's kraal. The British understand, having had sort of sussed out the customs of Nguni, what it means, umhlanti, what that space means in terms of a space of arbitration, in terms of sort of a space of council where Makana meets with the elders to make certain decisions. They understand all of that. And the best way to demonstrate the power of empire is to raise Makana's kraal to the ground and to place. It's also an epistemic move. It's a very, very violent epistemic move to say, your gods are dead.
Yes.
Here is our God. Here is our system of life.
And in Haiti, after the revolution, by 1805, the Catholic Church was evacuated out of Haiti. They also left. And Haitians at that point started, because of Vodun was very much in the Haitian history and in the Haitian mind, Vodun is very much part of the reason why Haitians won the Haitian Revolution. And so they started using the existing churches for Vodun ceremonies, right? So they, in an opposite sort of diasporic, they were like, oh, you're gone now? Well, you have a beautiful spot here. Do you know what I'm saying? And then, of course, there's a syncretism, of course, with the Catholic saints. So you can have all these images of all these white Catholic saints all over Haiti, painted on the walls, on murals, and the chromolithographs, everything. They all represent African gods, right? So there are many ways in which we can spin things.
And
right?
also thinking about, again, thinking about the fact that the Anglican Church sits on Makanda's kraal, in Grahamstown, what has now become known as Makanda with the recent name changes. The repurposing and the reclamation of that land and that space. Yes, today we're repurposing an Anglican cathedral, a Catholic basilica, a Catholic cathedral, but what sits underneath that space is sacred ground in the first instance. So
it's still sacred.
Precisely. So the work of there's the level of, as you're saying, reappropriating the Catholic space with the gods, with their saints, etc., etc. But the ground on which it stands is an even more significant reappropriation because it gives more power, more might to the ceremonies of those who are now repurposing. But I do want to go back to our question around exhibiting these these pieces. And because I think part of it is we've sort of touched on it right now, right? Which is to say there's a history. There's a much more deeper history that folks don't quite understand when it comes to engaging with these artifacts. But I am curious about your thoughts.
So my issue is with the displaying is really solely centered around the Benin Bronzes. Primarily because there's a history of anthropological ethnographic display that really, it's almost like trophy display. If you look at the difference between ethnographic museums and the way they display objects traditionally as opposed to the way that maybe art museums display objects, right? So they're in a case, like and I remember going to the Tervuren Museum in Belgium, and before they did the whole rethinking of it, and it was like you'd have all of these African objects, and then you'd have like Stanley's outfit and his helmet and his bat. In other words, like it was a way of grounding the extraction of these items in the colonial, in the colonial moment. Yes, exactly. So I'm hesitant because of the way in which these items were acquired, they were acquired violently, to display them in a way that would seem like, oh, look, we have these things. Do you know what I mean? I don't feel that way about all African
the
objects.
collections, yeah,
Not all
items.
African objects in the collections of the Peabody or anywhere else on campus or anywhere else in the world are all the result of violent genocidal actions. Not all. There are, now you could go there if you wanted to think about conversions. Many African communities converted to Christianity and Islam, and in the process of converting, really saw their past historical practices as maybe a form of idolatry, and then sold the items to the West, right? So that happened as well. You could see that as a form of violence too, but I hesitate to do that because then I think that also takes away agency. Conversions from one religion to another is something that has happened on the continent.
Time and again.
Like for centuries, like, you know what I mean? Like for centuries. And Islam is huge, right? It has always been has always had a really huge place in East and in West Africa, right? In fact, I would say that Arabic would be the language if you wanted to get around. That would be the language. But I think, but also you see people like the Fon having their own spirits, and then in proximity to the Yoruba, taking on some of the Yoruba spirits or deities, and you see people, communities going back and forth with different traditions. So I hesitate with the whole like conversion is violence thing. Like I do see it. I don't want to say I don't see it. I do see it, but I hesitate to go there.
And of course, one has to do the work again of contextualizing, right? Because I think this is the beauty of thinking about and thinking with Africa, is that, some folks take to religion, whatever form it might come in, because they want to change their lot.
Yeah.
Right? They want maybe upward social mobility. Some folks take to it because it is imposed upon them. So there's a whole host of stuff. And I think, when it comes to, especially the conversion discourses, one has access to, because with conversion came the culture of quote unquote letters and the massification of the culture of letters. Right? In the sense of folks converted, folks also then trained to be ministers, to be priests, which meant that they trained in the seminaries of the converted religion, right?
Sure.
Whether it be Islam, whether it be Christianity, and one can then go back to those histories to read. And in the process of reading one, I think, and this is what I found in the case of conversion in South Africa, which is what my doctoral was really thinking about in interesting ways, as that sort of informs statecraft, both in the late 19th century moving into the 20th and 21st century, and how we're still kind of recovering from the hang-ups of what we did back in the day. One has to read against the grain, right? In the sense of, for example, the first converts in the country, your Diosogas of this world, they have a particular relationship with Christianity that changes over time. And there's a collection of his letters that he writes to his children in his biography, which was published, I believe, in 1873. And he says to his kids, take your place in the world as black men, even though you might have a Scottish mother, because the world and the violence of the world against people who look like you and I is such that you will never be able to claim particular affinities with your mother. Which, of course, brings me to the second last question of our conversation, around, and I think we've touched on this, but I do want to ask the question in more pointed terms. And I think you've done a really, really incredible job of sort of sketching how one thinks about such an intersection. So I'm interested in, and this has come up in the show quite often, right? And I think will continue to be a theme that defines a lot of the conversations that we have of the show, and that's the question of the political as it intersects with the aesthetic. And I think as the African Collections curator, you're better placed to answer this question, because politics is constantly intersecting with the aesthetic, either in the question of, well, Africans are too inferior to create such art forms, which is itself a political statement, a racist statement that kind of gates us in a particular category of saying we're not capable of producing such artworks. If it's not that, it's
They act like they didn't come from us.
right,
Like that Homo sapiens just showed up on a European continent.
Right.
Yeah, it's so crazy.
Right.
Go ahead.
So if it's not this kind of inferiorizing racist move, it's always the question of, can we ever appreciate? So part of the conversations around repatriation, not necessarily with the Benin Bronzes, but around all repatriation, is, could Africans ever appreciate what we have done with these collections and what these collections signify and the artistic genius behind these works, right? So there's constantly this tension and intersection of politics with the aesthetic, and I wonder if you would care to say a couple of words on that.
Well, I think that ideally what we're going to see in the future is a kind of crossing of borders, right? Because one of the things I often tell the museum, the Peabody, and something I often tell visitors to the museum is there's no othering anymore, in the sense that the other, I mean, maybe you're still othering, but the other is not in some faraway place where you can go and study. We occupy the metropolis, we're cosmopolitans, we're everywhere you go, right? Like there are tons of Nigerians in Boston, there are tons of Haitians in Boston. And so their desire to see their culture is very prominent as well. I think in many cases, most of the people I know that are stakeholders in this discussion are in many ways feeling like they want the works to be accessible in Nigeria and to Nigerians, and also accessible globally. Like there has to be a happy medium somehow, and we have to figure out how to do that. I think also too that, you know, this is cultural patrimony.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be resolved. And I think that we are in the journey to resolving that. So I don't want this conversation to be taken out of context, in the sense that while I believe and I am completely committed to the truth of history as best as I can know it or understand it, that I understand that these are sacred objects, and in many ways these objects need to be accessible to the people who are most affected by them. If you talk about ontology, right? You talk about like the concept of the making of the self in this engagement, right, with these sacred objects. These objects are archives, they're history. There is also a definite impact when one is faced with them. So the aesthetics of them are more than just the formal characteristics, more than just the beauty. I had a colleague say to me, well, they're really not art because art is only about aesthetics, the other day. And I was really upset with that comment, because I said, that is not true. Art is not solely about aesthetics. And aesthetics is not solely about beauty, right? I think we need to be really, again, complicate these things, right? Because the aesthetics of these particular objects, although if you want to judge them from the Western perspective, they're masterpieces. I will totally go there with you. They are. At the same time, they incorporate a kind of energy and spirituality that goes beyond
Beauty.
Beyond beauty, way beyond beauty. You know, the Yoruba have this term Iwa, I'm probably pronouncing it right, but IWA, that is about, it's about experience and character, but it really is a word that describes beauty. It describes beauty, but the fact that it also describes character and experience and balance.
But the beauty is derived from the character.
Exactly, exactly. And these objects have they have character, they have experience. They have balance. They they have history. They have archives. They have information. They have words incorporated into them, even though they're not written words. There are words that emanate from them: water, strength, power. Like they're all kinds, and they're very specific, you know. And they speak to us. And so, I perceive. I don't often operate in an intentionally political way. I see myself more as this kind of like healer warrior on the crossroads kind of space where I'm facilitating
and mediating between
between worlds. And if you look at a museum like the Peabody, we are at a moratorium in terms of collecting, right? And part of the reason why I was eager to join and to be part, because it's a very, very contentious space and is often I would say, the target of much anger, right? And for a number of different issues, right? And for very good reasons. I like being in spaces like this because I feel that in this space I will be challenged and I will grow. And I was one of those angry people when I was young too. But I grew and I aged and God willing, I have some wisdom. And I feel that I'm very strategic in the way I do things. And
so it's become a matter of channeling the anger to positive ends.
It's also become a matter of observing the way things work. And understanding that if I can't get into a car and drive it with a wrench in my hand, you understand? That's not how I'm going to steer the wheel. I can't steer with a wrench, right? So it's not going to work. What tools can I use, right? Like what Kanye Silly says, like wiping the blood off the tool, right? Like she uses that quote, the Joseph Beuys quote. So you wipe the blood off the tool. So I have wiped the blood off the tools. And now the tools are more amenable to me because I don't have to see the violence every time I look at them. It's not that I disregard the violence. I know it was there.
But
For my mental health and for the mental health of the communities that I feel like I am mediating between, right? My goal is ethics. My goal is alerting people to unethical behavior.
You've just struck a chord there. You've just really struck a chord with, you know, I think of the work of Drusilla Cornell, God rest her soul, who she recently passed. And Drusilla Cornell, the first time that I thought about politics and the aesthetics is when she kind of, I think it was in 1995, in that collection that she did with, I forget. They're gonna come to me now. But she does this really, really cool. She coins this really cool concept of aligning the ethical with the aesthetic, right? Which is, she says that we've got to curate a world with and precisely the point that you're talking about, that the aesthetic is not just about beauty. The aesthetic is about the character. It's about the experience. It's about the ways in which we navigate all of those in one, because the beauty is derived from a morally virtuous character that gives us a particular kind of experience that we can then call an aesthetic experience, right? And aligning that with the ethical, which means sort of going about the world in a way that asks the question of how can we make the world a better place?
Which means we can't tell the story of these bronzes in a way that is incomplete to fit our politics, right? To get our way. Because inevitably the thing will happen again. But if we tell a deeper and more nuanced story and we expose the ways in which multiple players acted unethically, you know, the idea that currency of bronze was exchanged between Europeans and the Benin Kingdom for the purchase of many things: pepper, ivory, people. And those people were probably my ancestors, and many people's ancestors, many people from Jamaica came from this area, the Bight of Benin, means that we can then look at the lack of ethical thinking in that particular vein as well. And then that means that ethics is not raced. Because if ethics is raced, again, not negating colonial imperialism, because still upset about that. But if ethics is raced, then it means that we, as people of African descent, are off the hook to act unethically, right? Because we're always victims, right? We have no agency, we have no power.
Sure.
We can't, act unethically then, right? So I don't want that. I want to heal the wound. I want to change the encounter so it becomes an encounter in which we can work together collaboratively for a more positive future. People may be like, that's so idealistic, that's so like new agey. They can say whatever they want, right? I see a world in front of me with enormous potential. I see an escape from Afro-dystopia. I do see it. It's a clear way. It takes a little bit from Afro-pessimism, baby. It takes a little bit from Drusilla Cornell. It takes a little bit from Kant. Yeah, sure. Chinua Achebe is there. Mandela's there.
It's an amalgam.
It's a gumbo.
Exactly.
It's a big mix of callaloo, as they'd say in Trinidad, right? It's a mix-up, mash-up.
Now, to finalize our conversation, and thank you, really, I appreciate your time with us over the last 2 weeks. I really do. But I'm thinking about, and I think the Peabody was very lucky to get you.
Thanks for saying that.
They were very, very lucky. Precisely because, and this question really ties up with something that you've just mentioned, which is to say, it's been an institution that's, it's contentious, it's been sometimes at the receiving end of a lot of criticism. And I wonder what, say you've got maybe another 5-8 years before you want to do something exciting and different. What would you hope to kind of leave as not a dramatic or drastic legacy, but sort of as a redefined institutional culture of the Peabody? What would that look like for you? Whether it is dealing with the African collections and other collections, because of course you might necessarily be specifically working with African collections, but working in spaces we tend to kind of rub off.
I do work with other collections too. In my
Yeah.
role as academic partnerships.
Yeah. We rub off on other colleagues, we rub off on other spaces and other parts. So in 5-8 years' time, when we sit down and have this conversation again, I hope we do, by the way, what would you hope to kind of have left the Peabody with as a space that becomes more open, more receptive, more engaged? What would that look like for you?
I want my colleagues, and myself included, to believe in the object and the story that the object tells. Because in a world where the written, to cycle back to the beginning of our previous conversation, in a world in which the written holds enormous weight and there is not a lot of space for multiplicity, but a world that we want the answers, we want them to be clear, we want them to be precise. The object is throws a wrench in that. It's like a spanner. It's like the object doesn't have the easy written text. One has to engage with it. One has to research it. One has to go to different elements. One has to speak to creatives who maybe make objects like that. One has to speak to descendant communities about the object. The object is like a portal to an entire world. And that world is music and it's language and it's people and it's heartbeats and it's ocean and it's war and it's pain and it's greed. It's got a whole entire world. And if we can just listen to the object and what it tells us,
there's so much more that we can do.
There's so much more that we can do.
That's a beautiful way to end us off. And I hope that not only the Peabody, but also other institutions, because as I said, at the beginning of the second segment, the second part of our conversation, and even at the end of last week's conversation, some of the challenges and some of the insights, some of the challenges that we face, which is why I asked for your insights on this, specifically in your role in the Peabody, is that, some of the challenges are challenges that are replicable in other institutions. So you go to another institution, you find exactly the same problems. People are suspicious, people are afraid, people are angry at certain institutions because of how those institutions have acquired certain items, of how they have related to communities vis-a-vis having those items. And part of the criticism, for example, that we have back at home for some of our museums is that, between, for example, the Albany Museum and the Wits museums, we have at least, and this is a conservative number, 500 human remains that have not yet been repatriated. So part of the conversation and part of the reason why I was inviting some of these considerations is to think about that, is to say, how do we deal with people who are in shelves, in storage rooms, in institutions, and universities, being not having the language and the vocabulary and the capacity to even start with and talk about repatriating some of those human remains.
What's shocking to me about the existence of human remains, and it always was, even as a child when I looked at Egyptian things, I would just be like, how does one do that? Just decide they're going to go and I mean, it's not meant to be a judgment. I know that we gain a lot of very important information from osteology about human beings. But what is shocking to me, I guess maybe because of the culture I come from, is, there are entire novels based on the fact that a body's buried in a house or something, and that affects spiritually every single thing. So what shocks me, and again, it may be cultural, is that the sort of lack of connecting the idea that the institution cannot run to its best ability with these things unresolved, with these things existing within the space. That's a very spiritual take on it. It's not a very logical one. It's not a very practical one. It's not a very Western one. But the idea is that if there was a resolution of that spiritual energy, I think you would see a lot of things changing very quickly.
Very different, and
taking
a very, very different approach. And I think part of it is exactly that. I think it's to nudge some of our listenership, some of our audiences, to say, how do we reimagine our institutions, be it in culture, in terms of poetry, literature, and music, be it in artworks and institutions of culture, in the arts. How do we, and for me, part of doing that work is in thinking about and thinking with the Black Archive, right? What are our objects? What are our systems of self-constituting, of thinking about and cataloging for ourselves, not for anybody else, and not for exhibition and not for display, but for ourselves, our own ontologies as Black folks. And on that note, I would love to thank my guest for the past 2 weeks, Dr. Sarah Clunis, who is the Director of Academic Partnerships at the Peabody, as well as the Curator of the African Collection at the Peabody Museum here at Harvard University. Next week, I will be in conversation with an incredible an amazing young academic here at Harvard University, Professor Jesse McCarthy of the English and African American Studies departments, where we will be considering his most recent and exciting collection of essays, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul. I am Cecile Kumalo, your host of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, and I look forward to welcoming you next week.